Hi, this is Sable Schultz, she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Transgender Services at the Center on Colfax in Denver, Colorado. And here with me today is David Duffield, teacher and historian at the Center on Colfax, to talk about queer stories from the African diaspora. Hello, David. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of these stories and what has led you to start researching them?
Of course they will. So, hello guys, my name is, or hello folks, my name is David Duffield. I'm the historian at the Center on Colfax. I am a teacher by training during the day, and I work for the center as their history program manager. We started doing research at the middle school I teach in a couple of months ago to explore teaching an LGBTQ inclusive curriculum for world studies. I currently teach 6th and 7th grades. That talks about classical civilizations before about the Middle Ages, and then the Middle Age civilizations up until about the turning of the Renaissance and into the contemporary period. To my knowledge, about 14 months ago, a teacher at a conference asked me, well, do you have any sort of LGBTQ inclusive curriculum for world studies? And my answer at the time was no. So over the last few months, we began, a team of my colleagues and I at the school we teach at, began to research this, and we came up with a core set of lesson plans that I realized had an application beyond simply inclusive education. Those lesson plans talk about the history of LGBTQ people during the African diaspora, specifically the Middle Passage and the Atlantic slave trade, as well as pre-Columbian civilizations, particularly the Maya and the Inca, and how they view gender and sexuality. What began this journey was that we realized that we had so much more to talk about in terms of a queer representation for people of African descent. Most notably, that there was a worldwide phenomena to be had of talking about different representations of LGBTQ people for people who went through and continue to go through the African diaspora. So to answer your question, it began with a lesson plan and is now working its way into a series.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of talking about these stories, about sharing these stories? What is your goal? What is you're hoping that the audience is going to get out of this experience?
My hope is that the audience wants to learn more.
Mhm.
My hope is that whomever sees this video takes away that LGBTQ people have always been in many different cultures, and that the connection between colonialism and racism and all of the different forms of exploitation, but also the forms of liberation and resistance to those forms of exploitation, are rooted deeply in the queer idea, in the queer identity and queer history and the queer past.
That is really that's really important for right now, as well as we push back against white supremacy in our communities and our society. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the stories that you'll be sharing with us in this series?
Yeah. So there will be 6 stories in this series talking about representations of, and unfortunately, not enough time for everything we found, but this is the bulk of what we could find, talking about LGBTQ people in Africa before colonization, going back as far as Egypt and to the pastoralist peoples of South Africa to about the Iron Age. Then we're going to talk about the kingdoms, particularly of Western Africa, because this is where a large portion of the African diaspora began, along the quote unquote golden slave coasts. But we're also looking at people who had status and stature in each of these kingdoms, particularly the kingdoms of Benin and Dahomey, and in present-day Nigeria, several others. Then we're going to look at the lives of LGBTQ people, particularly LGBTQ, or particularly gay men in the Portuguese slave trade, as well as the Middle Passage for Africans to the Caribbean. And then we're going to look at the stories of women loving women, most notably using a term from Gloria Wecker called Matism, of these same-sex social environments that Black women used to create safety, and how that translated into different kinds of cultures and different kinds of vignettes, and really looking at how that translated throughout all the Western American countries and Caribbean and South American countries. And then we're going to look at a gentleman named Equiano, who was likely a gay or queer Black man in the British Empire. Other scholars have written about the homosocial and writings in his autobiography about how close he was to certain men, the guilt he felt around his sexuality. And though he married late in life, it's a good opportunity to explore traditional narratives. And we're going to stress the importance of rereading traditional African American and African diasporic narratives for queer history. And then we're going to jump to the 20th or the 19th century, towards the end of the slave period, and look at a gentleman named William Dorsey Swann, who after the American Civil War basically invented drag and drag balls in Washington, D.C. in the 1870s and 1880s. And then we're going to jump ahead about 50 years and look at the history of the HIV AIDS epidemic through the lens of queer person of color healthcare, and how the virus migrated, according to a book called Tinderbox, out of Zaire, out of the Congo, through the colonized economies, sex economies of Africa and into the Caribbean, and how the first person to die of HIV that we think in the United States, or the first documented case, was a young boy in 1969 who was 16 years old, named Robert Rayford, even though that's still a little unproven. Through that vignette, what we'll reveal is that the bodies of queer Black people have been subjected to many different kinds of violence and many different kinds of objectification. But there's also stories of resistance and diversity and plurality and continuation of culture despite these facts. We won't, unfortunately, get the chance to talk about scientific racism in the 19th century, but that is an area I would love to do more on.
Can you talk a moment about the importance of you as a white historian talking about these stories and the importance that the white community needs to hear about these stories?
Well, as a gay white male, I have to come to accept and acknowledge that I come from generations of privilege, right? In looking back in my family tree, I have ancestors who were present for Sherman's March to the Sea in Atlanta. But they were presumably people of Caucasian descent, right? It's inherited privilege that goes along with this that is one of the reasons I feel so passionate about talking about this. Not from a sense of patrimony, but from a sense of duty to address stories which aren't, in my experience, ever talked about in American history circles or in LGBTQ history circles. And to show that the roots of our cultures are as deep in all levels, despite who we are, where we come from. In short, I suppose it's simply to say that all our stories matter, and that particularly in this month, and Black History Month should not just be a month, we begin a dialogue to talk about the deep roots of LGBTQ people in the African diaspora.
That's amazing. And can you also maybe share, do you have any thoughts on, for viewers and listeners who are following along, what are maybe a few resources they could check out, either reading resources or organizations that are connected with some of these stories and helping out LGBTQ people of color?
For the historical purposes specifically, I'll be mentioning the sources that I used for this research throughout the series. So folks are welcome to check out the books on their own. The Committee for GLBT History for the American Historical Association is very, very good about looking at queer American history. There is, of course, too many other history projects that I can't name at this particular moment just off the top of my head. But what I will say is that with the research that we've done and with the books that we'll provide in this lecture series, folks can go through and find the stories for themselves. In particularly, they're going to discover, perhaps for the first time in their lives, the stories and the names and the categories of LGBTQ people in different societies throughout the African diaspora. So the important thing will be to pay attention to the sources and the names and the categories, but also to begin using those as platforms to look for more information.
And we'll be making sure to include links to organizations, books, and other resources that David utilizes in this project down in the description of these videos. In the meantime, if this sounds like a series of interest to you, be sure to subscribe and like this video and hit the notification bell. And again, check out our information down in the description.